Mic check, testing 1, 2. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Great. Do you mind turning the projectors on and routing that video here? Also checking second handheld mic, making sure the sound's good. Mic check test. I'll leave this mic on for the moment. Mic check, great. Okay, go ahead and, do you want to check the live stream on the Mac for audio quality, or do you feel it's good? Great. Then you can mute the TriCaster and turn on the music.
So good evening, everyone. So welcome to the Translational Medicine Institute. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Aaron Massachar. I'm going to be your host over the next couple of days, so hopefully my voice isn't too annoying because you'll be hearing a lot of me over the next little bit. A couple of housekeeping points that I've been told that I'll get reprimanded if I don't bring up. There are fire exits in the building. They are on the north, south, yes. North and east of the building. So just, why would I know where the fire exits are? Yes, there's the stairs, and there's also another set of stairs on the far side of the building. Tonight's program, we're going to go through just a brief introduction. We've got an introductory video. Dean Stetter is then going to come up and talk with us for a little bit. And then Chad Ray, I'm hoping Chad is around. Chad, there he is, wonderful. So Chad is then going to talk a little bit about Zoetis. And then from there, we're going to try something a little bit different with our keynote. Instead of having somebody kind of present for 30 minutes or so, we're going to try to engage in a bit of a conversation. This is a smaller group. There's a lot of familiar faces. I know you all have a lot to say about veterinary medicine, so we're hopeful that that will turn into a really nice conversation. But to kick things off, we're going to start with a video.
It's sleepless nights, literature reviews, thesis defense. It's cups, no, pots of coffee. Showing up, suiting up, being where you never thought you could be. It's walking, trotting, a run at full blast. It's looking into the microscope and somehow seeing the bigger picture, knowing what has never been known before. It's one more round, one more animal saved, one more person cured, and one less species endangered. It's boundary breaking, change making, earth shaking. This is how we care.
And Dean Mark Stetter.
Thanks, Aaron. Thanks for coming to play in our little town. So on behalf of the Veterinary Innovation Summit, Fort Collins, Colorado State University, College of Vet Med and Biomedical Sciences, welcome. We're really excited to have you here. I'm hoping in the days ahead you'll be able to see the beautiful foothills and the mountains out here. We do have the fire pit going. If it stops raining enough, you can enjoy the patio out there. But this is really special for us. We know that the people in this room are the ones that are super interested in the future, super interested in advancing things, super interested in thinking about new ways of doing that. Great clinicians, great scientists, great futurists, great entrepreneurs. And we're really excited to host you here in a building that we think is oozing all of those type of things, oozing what we as a profession can do, as far as thinking differently and as far as bringing new technology to the profession. So really excited to have you here. I want to thank several folks, certainly Eleanor Green and A&M, who started this several years ago and have been kind enough to share that with us, and VMX also, who have allowed us to kind of be part of that tradition and carry that on. I also really want to thank the sponsors that helped us pull this off, and you'll see your logos are proudly displayed a variety of places throughout the building, and we thank you for your support. The TMI folks, we have just opened this last spring, and we're really ramping up hosting folks here, and tonight I think is a great example of how we can do that. So thanks to Aaron and Jerry and Sam and Kara, Jeff, Lawrence, and Dane for putting this on tonight and for the next couple days. We really appreciate all your work. And then lastly, thanks for all of you from coming from all over the country, in some places from out of the country to join us. We're really proud of what we're doing here and really excited to have you guys kind of all creative juices in this great place over the next couple days. So thanks very much. Aaron, back to you.
Okay, next up we've got Chad from Zoetis. One of the reasons why I asked Zoetis to come and talk is there's a really new and exciting building that's being erected just over that way, and so Chad is going to share a little bit about that from Zoetis.
Get those slides. No slides. No slides. That's all right. Yeah, so for those of you that were here last night, you probably got to see at the TMI talks, some of my colleagues and I presented what's really gave an overview of what the Zoetis incubator is, what we're calling our new research lab that we just established at the Foothills campus over at the IDRC. So about a year ago, we decided that we wanted to enhance our early discovery front-end engine at Zoetis, and we decided what we wanted to do was really focus around a systems biology approach to early discovery. And when we did that, we pitched the idea to the executive team, and they liked what we were saying, but they said, why don't you think a little more innovative, be a little more creative with it? And we thought about some of our experiences. Myself and my boss were both from Pfizer Human Health, and they had a program called Centers for Therapeutic Innovation, where they co-located some of their research scientists at major medical centers so that they could be closer to the patient and have a shared opportunity with the research scientists to bring forward new targets. And it was really working quite well. So we thought maybe we should try to take a page out of their book. And so we examined many different universities around the country to see where we could find, top talent, great facilities, access to core laboratories that would really enhance our science. And after looking across the country, we selected Colorado State. And right now, I can tell you we're at a point where we've signed the lease. We're knocking down walls, building laboratories, hiring people. I'm really tired right now because we've interviewed over 40 people this week. It's a great place to find talent. When you think about the Boulder, Denver, Fort Collins corridor, there's a ton of talent. And the university, with all those great scientists, we just feel like we're in a great position to really enhance our ability to find new targets and what we're calling the innovation life cycle. We feel if we throw some capital at a really interesting problem, which is focusing on bovine immunology, we want to take and find alternatives to antibiotic therapy. We feel like by being here, bringing that problem, coexisting with the science that's going on here, we feel like we can enhance and speed up the process for finding new targets and potentially new drugs. So, that's where we're at. Hopefully, in 3 or 4 years, we can come back and tell a story similar to the one we did last night, which is we highlighted our advances and innovations in dermatology. So, for those of you who practice, you know that Apoquel and Cytopoint are two very exciting medications that's really revolutionized the treatment of atopic dermatitis. And we feel like if we can take the learnings from that and apply it similar to the field of livestock, we believe we can find alternatives to antimicrobials. So I think that was what I was hoping to highlight. I had a few slides, but next time maybe, hopefully when we have a much better story that we can tell about all the great advances that have happened by being co-located with the university. So we're happy to be here. Thank you. It's been nice.
Okay, so next up, we're going to go into our keynote talk, and I'm going to pull up Steve Eidelman in a moment. Before we get there, though, how many people have been to the Innovation Summit in Texas before? Oh, that's awesome. Okay. And how many people here are veterinarians? Yeah, that's good. Okay, so what we want to go through next is just a little bit of a conversation around what innovation means. We were thinking about this presentation, we were thinking, there's a lot of slides that we can talk, everyone can talk about Uber, everyone can talk about Airbnb, but what do those actually mean? And what does it mean for the veterinary profession? Because I think that a lot of people tend to get a little bit worried about some things that are on the periphery, thinking about Amazon, thinking about all these different things that might impact the profession, and we're not necessarily thinking about some of the underlying conditions that give rise to it. So how do we think a little bit better about innovation, and how do we generate a conversation around what innovation means? Because I think too much of the time innovation just becomes a buzzword. Right? We talk about innovation, we talk about disruption, we talk about synergies, but what does that actually mean? Almost every single time I have a conversation with Steve, he makes me pretty uncomfortable because I have certain assumptions that I make. And anyone who's talked with Steve, you probably have a similar experience. And he just questions your assumptions and he says, is that what's really going on? He's got a really unique background. He worked at Bain, he worked for Warner as well, and a lot of consulting experience. He co-founded Whistle, so everyone knows the Whistle callers, co-founded that. That grew into a larger company, which then was sold to Mars. He became part of the Mars team. So I think he's got a really interesting perspective on what veterinary medicine is doing now, what are the underlying conditions that are giving rise to some of these changes, and that's what we wanted to talk about tonight. So I'm hoping that it will be a conversation, and to kick that off, I'll bring up Steve.
Hello, cool. Thanks everybody. Thanks for the intro, Aaron. Are we standing or sitting, or what are we doing?
We can sit. Yeah.
We'll sit, we'll stand. Thank you. So Aaron asked me to do the keynote after Amazon didn't quite make it, and I was actually
I'm happier because Steve is here. That's what I was aiming for, and I figured I could never get him. But
yeah, exactly.
I had to turn down Amazon, so Steve's here.
I am actually happy that didn't happen too, because I think it's very easy to go get a big name company, especially kind of tech, innovation, have them come and tell us all how they think about the world and what they're doing. And I think in having spent now, we started Whistle in 2012. And while that wasn't directly tied to veterinary, we desperately were trying to sell a lot of whistles through the veterinary channel, and we're unsuccessful in doing that. And through that, by banging on enough doors, you learn a little bit of something. And then landed at Mars and spent a few years at Mars. And a few of my former colleagues are here from the digital health team at Mars, where we were trying to innovate within the veterinary business inside of Mars. I think what we realized was there's a lot of deeper insights you have to understand about this industry to actually innovate from within it. And so I am happy that turned out this way. And Aaron and I have had many over the years, a lot of debates about what companies are successful and why they're successful. And there are a lot of assumptions. We have to make assumptions because we don't all know the actual underlying stories of how these companies came to be. And even when you hear the stories, a lot of times they're not actually even themselves reflecting on the actual kernel of insight that led to the business being germinated in the first place, or ultimately why it was successful. So what I was hoping to do when Aaron asked me to do a presentation was well, why don't we talk about kind of why are we still having all these same conversations and not seeing a lot of progress in certain areas? I'd say we're actually making a lot of progress. Just earlier I was talking to Sam from VetSpire about all the different kind of models that we're seeing in veterinary medicine pop up. A lot of them are just kind of different attempts at trying delivery of veterinary care. Nothing really out there on the frontier of tech, cutting edge tech. And I think that's exciting just to see more and more of that popping up. But excited to have a conversation. I will call on people if you don't participate. I have no shame. And so I encourage, I think one of the benefits of it being a smaller group here is that we can have a conversation. And so I want to sell questions, sort of, don't be shy. There are no right answers. We're going to ask kind of what you think success means, what are examples of successful companies, why you think they're successful. I really encourage you guys to just take a crack at it. There is no right answer. That's why slides don't really make sense for this, because I can tell you what I read in TechCrunch or what I learned from some product manager at Uber or whatnot, but those aren't really the real answers. So we have to kind of together just ask enough questions to hopefully inspire some people in this room to figure out some of the answers. So, with that.
So we would love to hear examples that you think are successful. So companies that are successful in the veterinary space.
Or pet care more broadly, I think. We kind of talked about a lot of things that are outside the veterinary space that sort of are touching pet care. But yeah, I think if we broaden to pet care, if you think about the last decade, if you think of just a few big names that pop up, or you don't even big names, just names that pop up in your mind that you think of as being successful examples, innovation, sure, or just companies that have grown a lot over the last 10 years and sort of understanding why they've grown. But any names, throw them out. Claudia. Chewy. Great one. So a little bit of information on Chewy just to set the stage before we talk about that one. So Chewy got started about 6 months before we started Whistle. I can't disclose exactly how much revenue Whistle's doing, but let's say it's somewhere in the teens of millions of revenue still only. Chewy's doing over $4 billion in revenue this year. So I would say that that's successful. I think we can, it would be great to talk about what success even means, because I think there are varying degrees of success or different definitions for different people, but Chewy's a great one. I guess, Claudia, what to you about Chewy, like what screams success, or what made you think of Chewy?
The convenience, the fact that they're anticipating what I need next for my pet. And
Convenience and anticipation of what you need next. And what else?
they're anticipating what I need next for my pet and offering it to me before I even think to ask for it.
And offering it to you before you ask for it, yeah.
For instance, the pharmaceutical, offering me pharmacy
Right.
opportunities when all I got before was toys and dog food. Being able to discount your order by getting on a plan where you have it sent to you, how quickly it's shipped to you. And
Can people hear, by the way, or should we? No? Here, why don't we? Yeah, sure.
So what I like about Chewy is that it anticipates me as a consumer and as a pet owner before I know what I'm going to do next. They're in my inbox in my email, making me an offer for Apoquel or any other product that my pet might need that's a pharmaceutical product. That wasn't a service that I knew that they offered until I got that email from them. And now it's much more convenient, and they even made me a discounted offer if I was willing to go through them. Their ability to have your item shipped to you right when you want it, or making it easy for you to delay it. Say I overestimated how quickly I would need it. They make it really seamless and easy to delay the order, and they don't make you jump through hoops to do any of the stuff that you're doing. And the fact that when it's my dog's birthday, I get a handwritten card from them, that says, congratulations on being a great pet owner, wishing your dog Bridger a happy birthday. It's just really a nice touch. I think they're thoughtful, and I want them to succeed. And because they get some of my hard-earned money, I think that I'm voting for them to succeed by being a customer of theirs. So I think they reflect well on me, and that's really unique.
Well, sounds like a pretty amazing experience. But I guess what would you say, I guess just a really quick follow-up, I guess what would you say, if you had to summarize it, relative to the incumbents that they were playing in the same space as, what was that kernel of what did they, if you were starting that company, if you were the founder of Chewy, what did you see back in 2012 when they were getting started that made you say, this is an opportunity?
The fact that I didn't have to go anywhere to get my dog food because it weighs so much. I didn't want to have to carry it into the house, into the car, from the cart, get somebody to load it off the shelf into the cart. Convenience.
Right. And what's interesting about that, though, is that if many of us can remember a company during the first .com boom called Pets.com, which had the same insight. So one thing that's interesting, I think, in the context of this bigger question of success and why are some of these companies so successful is kind of the environmental conditions, so to speak, or where the world is at the time, enabling technologies, consumer behaviors that are also in place. So I think what you described is this incredible experience that, quite frankly, in 1999 or 2000 when Pets.com was out in the market, kind of the same thing. Nobody would say, I don't want that, right? And ultimately, they were offering a very similar offering at a high level about what you described. So I think what's interesting about Chewy is a couple things. One, relative to the veterinary industry, is they were going after something that wasn't dependent on really anybody else in the ecosystem, and I think that's something that we should talk a lot about in veterinary medicine. There are a lot of dependencies. It's very hard to innovate within this industry because there's massive fragmentation, 28,000 veterinary clinics, tens of thousands of veterinarians. Each one has their own workflow and their ways of working, and then all of the different client behaviors that are coming in, and you can sort of standardize certain behaviors from a consumer perspective a lot more easily than you can operators of different businesses, small businesses, right? So Chewy had that going for it, which is one, just they're playing in a market where if you offer the best product, everyone can go and buy it if it's easy to get it, and then you have a massive kind of consumer company. The other big thing, though, is that the world had changed a lot from 2000 to 2012. Amazon had gotten huge, right, obviously, and they were developing a lot of logistical sort of improvements. I mean, Amazon single-handedly had created a change in how FedEx and UPS and USPS operate, and they themselves have been developing out their own logistics arm, right? So if you are Chewy, you see that the rails basically to build that same business that was attempted almost 15 years earlier trying it again in a very different environment. Now everybody also has, is much more comfortable purchasing online. Everybody has their credit cards all over the internet. They're much more accustomed to purchasing, not just online, but expecting 2-day shipping and 1-day shipping. And so all of a sudden that story that you described seems a lot more real. Like I as a consumer expect that 1 or 2-day shipping because of my experience with Amazon. I expect to be putting my credit card information online. I expect to have really great reviews and full transparency. I expect the products to be very visible in my search results, et cetera. And if you went on PetSmart.com or Petco.com, that wasn't quite the case. And so there wasn't some great insight, really, right? It was just the same idea 15 years earlier, but the world had changed. And there was a laser focus on really one thing, which I think what you described was amazing customer service. And that was kind of it. It wasn't that they weren't telling a story about we're sourcing the best products in pet care or anything like that. They have every product, right? And so they solved a lot of logistics, and they focused on doing one thing really, really well, which is customer service. So not to underplay like the execution, I think that's the other big thing about innovation is there's a lot of great ideas, and people like to dismiss ideas or just a dime a dozen. Sure, there are a lot of great ideas out there. They're not that sacred often. But then the execution of them is everything. So Chewy executed extremely well, but they stayed really focused to the point where I just spoke to Chewy recently, and I asked them a few questions, and the only thing they said to me was, as long as it creates a better customer service experience, we will do it. Didn't care about anything else. And so that focus has continued with them being a public company, being acquired and sold, and then taken public, and it's still the same thread deep down in the organization as that when they first got started, we're focused on customer service. So it's an interesting one. Thanks for bringing that one up.
So I think it's really interesting that, like, from a behavioral perspective, right, like that hasn't really changed, that people just want easier experiences. And those companies who are able to do that, they're going to be more successful than a company who's not able to do that. So it's interesting that just kind of underlying all of that stuff, there's always that there, is are you providing a better experience for your customer, yes or no? And that seems to be one of the main drivers for a lot of change that's happening. Can people think of other examples where there has been just a phenomenal customer experience in the pet space in general?
So I will openly admit I've never been in front of the practice management software EasyVet, but as a founder who works alongside practice management softwares and is constantly being asked about integration and working alongside, I think that, and also working along some specialists who just came from that practice management software and were forced to adopt something else. I think they've done a very good job with their customers of taking what you're talking about, Steve, with everybody's workflow being different inside of 28,000 veterinary hospitals, and being able to make a software that can tailor to the workflow of that practice, and then it says it in the name, but be able to be trained without a lot of change capital, and being able to bring people in and use it without extensive training. So along the lines of ease, I mean, the efficiency inside of a veterinary practice needs to be at an optimal performance now more than ever, with veterinarians being in demand, and I think EasyVet has done that from a workflow standpoint.
Yeah, it's a great one. I think in general, I talked about this a couple years ago, VIS, I think it was a couple years ago, a year and a half ago, but just how important the practice management system really is to unlocking a lot of the ecosystem. And I'm hesitant to even say the word ecosystem in veterinary medicine, because I think so many things are disparate and disconnected because of the lack of connectivity, and a lot of that starts with the practice management system. So I think, if you're basically the brain of the practice, you have to create really, really good experience for your customer who is the veterinarian using that. I guess any other examples within veterinary medicine people have seen?
As a consumer of their product, I think from a lab testing perspective, Zen Labs needs to be mentioned at this conference. I don't know if anybody here has ever used them, but as far as diagnostics and just-in-time information, they're really on cutting edge.
Can you compare? So I'm familiar with Zen Labs, and they're doing awesome stuff. Very early, though. And I only caveat that saying it's hard to assess sort of like what they're doing really differently and how it's working and how successful they might be, right? So super knowledgeable people behind it, so I have a very strong feeling they'll be very successful. But what would you describe as the key difference that you're seeing from what they're offering relative to maybe existing legacy players in the industry? And what was like their kernel, if you had to guess, like what was their kernel of insight?
I believe their attention to details as pertains to listening to veterinarians. I have not received any feedback from any of our veterinarians that didn't like the customer service they gave to them. And their ability to take a business model in testing that is very complicated when it comes to billing and make it extremely easy for veterinarians to comprehend.
You mean in terms of like their pricing being really simplified? Yeah. It's a great example. So actually, it would be great to come back later to sort of reflect on like what other untapped opportunities there might be with similar sort of, like if you look at products or services or vendors that you guys are, there's a lot of veterinarians in the room. So as vets, whether practicing now or previously, that are still points of frustration. And maybe there isn't a clear solution, but maybe like working with a legacy diagnostics company, you might have said in the past while practicing, the pricing is really complicated. Like that in itself is a moment to then ask, like, is there something that I can do differently because that's still complicated? And oftentimes, like kind of going back to the pets.com versus Chewy point, like the world may not have changed. Sometimes it's okay, it hasn't changed and there's still an opportunity to do something really different. Oftentimes something has to change. The reality though with technology is it is always changing really fast. The founder of Box, I don't know if you guys know Box, it's a file storage company, Aaron Levy. I remember a long time ago when we were starting Whistle, he said something that said, if you're starting a business that you could have started 18 months ago, you're probably starting it, or you can say the other way around. Basically, you want to be starting a business that you couldn't have started 18 months ago, meaning like the technology didn't exist 18 months ago. Now that's like more cutting edge technology. I'd say in an industry that's probably 30 years behind, we don't need to be quite 18 months out, but the reality is like we aren't taking advantage of technologies that are 10 years old, 15 years old, I would say even 20 years old oftentimes. So if you think about what's changed in the world and then reflect back on problems that are sometimes fairly obvious, like, wow, the pricing is really confusing, or it takes forever to get the prescriptions shipped, or the hours of operation of a veterinary clinic aren't really sufficing relative to client expectations or anything like that. And you can ask like what has changed in the world, right? And that's oftentimes been the germinating kind of point for a lot of new businesses. And whether or not they're successful is sort of the thing that whether it's execution or maybe the world hasn't really changed or there's other like pre-existing conditions that make it really difficult to evolve. But let's keep going through some other examples. So maybe going outside of veterinary. Oh, yeah, go ahead. You have one within the industry?
Thank you, Aaron. I'm just interested as to whether you think that Covetrus is a success or an inevitability, or what your view of that kind of model is.
I really want to ask if anyone's here from Covetrus. I'm going to offend people tonight, so I'm just going to do it. I can't say that I think it's a success. I mean, I think that the challenge with big companies is you use the word inevitable. There is an inevitability that sort of appears, I would say, a lot of times on PowerPoint slides. And there's a lot of synergies that if you smash this together with this, this will happen. Sometimes they actually do make kind of organically, things make sense together. The challenge for me, just as a customer, so we didn't talk about, I'm not going to talk too much about it, but I started a new company last year called Modern Animal. Dr. Christy Long is one member of the founding team. We got started in December, and so now we're customers of a lot of the companies we're talking about. They were really hard to get a hold of, really hard to understand the business model. I think they had a hard time understanding what we were doing. We weren't asking for much, but it wasn't that there aren't good intentions there, but just it's really hard to integrate these big companies. And where are the real synergies? So if you think about like pharmacy and practice management software that's existing in the business, and supply, being a supplier, it makes sense, right? Like. Which piece specifically?
If they're controlling
No. Everybody should have a microphone.
If they're controlling the data from, conceivably from the distributor through the veterinarian, through to the consumer, and through the PIMS potentially as well, do you think that data flow is valuable enough to, I guess, for the inconveniences they're going to have with meshing these?
What would you do with that data?
I mean, again, I think if you can, I think you can be smart around it and use it predictably, like some of the people like Chewy are, or, actually, again, whether it's prediction or sales or trending or whatever else, and actually use that from an industry point of view. But I don't know, that's kind of the question as to how useful we think that is.
Yeah, I think that one's a really interesting example because beyond my kind of more cynical statement of just big companies smashing things together, the promise of a lot of data is always very exciting to not just big companies, to everybody. The challenge is if you're not solving a problem for somebody, then that data is useless, right? So what is the problem you're solving, and is data going to make it easier for you to solve that problem for them? I'd say first they have to solve the problem. So either they have to be even better than they used to be independently at providing, as Vet's First Choice was at providing pharmaceuticals, as Henry Schein was at being a supplier, or as Henry Schein was as being a practice management software provider. And them being together, while that creates a bunch of data under one corporate entity, it doesn't actually make any of those necessarily individually better. I think we could all come up with a bunch of ways that it could be better, but I can't speak to whether that's their focus or not. So data is this very exciting thing, and people are always very excited. I mean, I can't tell you the number of startup pitches, forget veterinary medicine, just in general in startups, I see around chapter 1 of the business is we're gonna do this thing, and maybe it'll work, maybe it won't. But chapter 2 is gonna get really exciting. We have all this data, and we're gonna do all this crazy stuff with this data. But that's totally predicated on chapter 1 being successful. If you don't have all of those customers using your product all the time, the way you're saying that they will, you don't have that data. And then chapter 2 was about how all the data was going to be really exciting, but then what do you do with that data? So there are really amazing data businesses, but I don't think that's what we're actually talking about. We're talking about companies providing products or services being much more effective at providing products or services because they have all this data. And that's not usually the case. That's why so many startups are successful at disrupting bigger companies in all these other industries, and it's not because of the data. Now, eventually they become massive owners of data, and they can do a lot of interesting things, but the most interesting thing they can do is just provide better service. So Chewy uses their data to be more responsive, pick better products, price things differently, all of that. But so the Covetrus deal was very interesting. I think, as a counterpoint to my point I just made, if you look back at practice management systems as an evolution over the last 30, 40 years, they basically got monopolized by one diagnostics company and one supplier. And that's really interesting because they were able to offer the software at very low cost, and it made a ton of sense for them strategically. Hey, put the software in and order more diagnostics. Put the software in and we'll know when you need to reorder, or you can reorder more easily. Great strategic move. So if we were sitting here whenever those acquisitions happened, 10, 15, 20 years ago, or whichever practice management system at the time that they were acquiring, we might have said the same thing, oh, they're gonna have access to all this information. Is that really gonna be more valuable? Is it dangerous for the industry? But really what happened was they were just inserting themselves more directly to provide, hopefully, and probably, I think, better service ultimately to veterinarians at lower cost, doing it more quickly, right? If I can order my labs through Cornerstone, that's a faster, better experience for me. And maybe that allows IDEXX to do it more cheaply because they have less staff that they have to, to pay for to manage ordering. I'm just spitballing now, but long-winded answer, but hopefully somewhat, clarifying, at least on how I think.
So when I talk with you about things like success, and we kind of talk through it, and it seems like we're kind of talking about different definitions of success, right? So Covetrus or some of the other examples, it seems like you're operating with a different definition than what we might think as being successful. So somebody might say a company is successful because they have a viable product and they're selling it, and it's maybe a bit more than a hobby, right? It's a lifestyle business or something like that. It doesn't seem like that would satisfy your criteria for success, even though it might be like solving a problem, but it might be just in kind of a super niche market and not really successful per se. Am I off?
Yeah, no, I think it's great. Yeah, so I think when we all come to these types of conferences, we're talking about disruptive success that's at some level of scale. But I think it's a great point especially for an industry like this that is so fragmented. And within the industry, there are niches within the industry, which itself is maybe potentially considered a niche, right? So whether it's a problem that only emergency and specialty hospitals face, or only a certain type of specialty practitioner faces, those are all problems that need to be solved, and someone can create a solution, and it can be a very successful solution for that problem. I think there's a lot of those examples out there. Sometimes they build themselves build themselves up to be kind of more than that, and they try to go beyond that, and they raise a lot of capital, and then when you raise a lot of outside capital, that means you have to now be even bigger, and you have to justify your existence to some much bigger level and scale. But I think a lot of the greatest successes are companies that have been built over a long period of time, solving a very specific problem for a very specific customer, and then naturally have evolved beyond that or have stayed within that and hopefully have kept innovating within that. But I think there's a number of really great examples in this industry of companies that are maybe not your headline most innovative company, and maybe some that are, but they're still quite small, but they are methodically, customer by customer, solving problems and finding more and more scalable ways to do it by leveraging technology. I think success is just when you find a market and a product market fit, as a lot of people talk about it, but it's something that is not, it doesn't face the same resistance that a lot of ideas do, where they're having to justify their own existence. Like, I think that there are a lot of startups that will present a lot, will talk a lot, will pitch a lot of investors, as you have to, pitch a lot of press, do all those things, and they're constantly sort of justifying their existence versus going to customers to justify their existence. If customers aren't justifying your existence, that's not success. If they are, it's just about matching up sort of how you're building the company, how you're funding it, how big of a team, and how big is that market? How many customers are there? What are they willing to pay you? And if you find that, that to me is success.
Other examples that people have? Yeah, Ken.
I mean, take Chewy for an example. To my knowledge, they haven't made any money yet. Mike, I think, and I'm not saying that that's the motive. I think what you're saying about the customer experience is very important. In fact, when Claudia was talking about the experience that she had, Chewy should have been YouTubing that, because that was like a testimonial that you would want every customer to ever talk about your business in any way. But at the end of the day, they've been around since 2012 and have raised a lot of money. But at some point in time, somebody's got to say, how do the investors get a return?
For sure. And for those of you following kind of broader tech news, or really general news at this point, I think WeWork in the last 2 weeks has stumbled so hard. The CEO stepped down. They had a valuation that was almost approaching, in terms of expectations, of $50 billion, and now I don't even know what it is. I think it's not much more, if not the exact same amount of invested capital. So because of the business model, like, can they ever make money? Great point. I think that, I'm glad you brought it up, because a lot of people would argue with Amazon about this a lot too over the years. Amazon didn't make a profit for a very long time, or if they were kind of breaking even, losing money, making a little bit of money, break even. I'm definitely a believer in that approach of, if you're putting all of your money back into innovation and growth and testing things, and a lot of things that don't work and some things do, that's how you become a 100-year company. But yeah, Chewy, so far, I would say Chewy has to prove, to become a really successful business long-term and be self-sustaining, it has to do something differently. And yeah, go ahead.
I would agree, because I think that Amazon is probably setting the standard for having data, understanding data to get insight to every single transaction. That just like Google came along and said, we're going to give you access to the world with 2 clicks of a mouse or whatever, they're teaching the world to understand the value in data at every transaction point. And I think while they're losing money and everything else other than their web services, I think it's doing a good service for everyone else. The last point I want to make is, talking about customer experience, the other thing I'd like to have your comment about is not just the customer experience, but thinking about, for entrepreneurs in the room, where they can have an opportunity to remove friction in an interaction, and then from removing friction, then build the customer experience around that. Because I think there's many places in veterinary medicine where there's too much friction in delivering the product, service, or idea to the end user.
What are some? I totally agree. So, maybe, what are some examples of where that friction remains today?
I could, the thing about any type of interaction, for instance, there's friction in financial access in veterinary medicine, because there's a lot of money banging around pet healthcare in general, but the consumer doesn't have it. They're spending it in PetSmart, but they're not spending it in the veterinary hospital. So I think that's an opportunity. And is there an opportunity to build or improve the friction between the philanthropy that's there and the leveraging of financing or pet health insurance or whatever? So I would see that as an opportunity to reduce friction. I think I could probably, if you gave me a couple more minutes, I'd come up with a couple more ideas in friction.
You'd probably come up with a lot more.
You're talking about just about the fact that there's 40% compliance across the board in veterinary medicine, right? So 40% compliance says that 6 out of 10 people that come into a veterinary practice are saying, thank you, I'll get back to you on that. So that means that we have a tremendous upside there. So I would say those are all friction points.
That's a great point.
I should probably note that while we're talking, the bar is still open, so you're more than welcome to grab a drink as we keep going. In my experience, the more we drink, the better the conversation gets, so please go ahead.
So I have an example, but I also think for Chewy that their momentum is coming. As a specialist in private practice, I can tell you that, you know, that's where all of our clients are going, and I think, you know, coming along with that, we're going to basically
Measuring success. Is that, you know,
Well-
how long do you wait? That's what I was saying.
well, I think they should be patient because I think it's coming. But my second one would be instinct as
a
for
great one.
something that's working.
Can you talk a little bit more about instinct?
So we just rolled out Instinct at my practice, probably within the last couple of months, and I've been begging for some type of electronic whiteboard for years before we rolled this out, because in practice, the ability to communicate from the back and the front and, you know where your patient's going and have treatment sheets that automatically populate so you're not missing things and people, you know, we're not being ignored. I don't know, it's just, I've been waiting for it, so I'm so happy to have a product. Very user-friendly, very responsive to what we need.
I think it's a great example of Dr. Frankel is just solving a very specific pain point and building around it very methodically. And it's not about what it might become, even though he has a very big vision. It's about what it's doing today for every single customer that has has it in their clinic. And I think that's a great example of where this industry. This is the flip side of like the Chewy example, right? I think Chewy's now like 25% of all pet care e-commerce, or maybe 20% of all pet products, maybe e-commerce. Either way, it's crazy. I don't think we're going to have that in veterinary care at the service delivery level in the clinic, in 7 years. So, how do we 7 years from now, if we're in a room like this together, how are we talking about pieces of software or different ways that workflow has changed or how we service customers that have fundamentally changed the way things are done? But it's probably less. It was a website and everybody started coming to it, or it was an app that everybody downloaded. It's probably much more ingrained in the actual workflow of the hospital, and that makes it harder. A little bit less sexy, a little bit more, a little bit more painful. But that's how we'll solve a lot of those friction points that we're, just hearing about.
So you mentioned something before we talk about data, because that's one of my personal passions, but you mentioned something a little bit ago about 10, 15, 20 years behind. I think you said 30. And depending on who you talk to, there's actually significant parallels between veterinary medicine and human medicine, late 90s, depending on which technology, early 80s, if you look at other areas. So we're dealing with kind of a human nature, which goes to the friction point, depending on whether you're the client or the clinician or the staff. Why do you think we keep running into these issues of problems that I don't want to say solved, because having been in human medicine before veterinary medicine, I wouldn't go so far to say solved. I say at least smoothed over. Why do you feel like in veterinary medicine we constantly keep saying, oh, we're 10, 15 years behind, when we already know the 2 decades plus of mistakes that have been made? We already know the 2 decades of success stories that have been done, yet we seem to be constantly saying that in any lecture, any kind of talk that we have. And so what do you think is, besides the overarching theme of human nature, what are some specifics? So you talk about that kernel, talk about that impetus for success. I think that has a huge role to play in not repeating the mistakes of the past.
Well, I think that's a great question, and I'm not going to pretend like I have the answer to that. So I would love for this to be a discussion point. Because from my point of observation, I think that it's a problem with the customer in this case, who is willing to adopt the innovation. And realistically, when we talk about veterinary care, the customer really is the veterinarian. The client, if you were open different hours, if you were available in a very easy way in different ways, if you were pricing things differently, clients would do it. If it was less friction, easier to do, clients would do it. If they're not doing it, it's because you're not doing a good job delivering that. The crazy thing is just how many good things have actually been built within veterinary medicine, and they're not adopted either at all or not quickly enough by veterinarians. So I think of them as the real customer that has had a hard time evolving. And so my theory about it is, again, I'm probably gonna offend some people in the room, but I think that the private equity consolidation trend was a massive deterrent for innovation. I think that if you're a veterinarian and you've owned a practice for 20, 30 years, and you are faced with the decision, do I invest in new software? Do I rip out all of my systems? Do I invest in changing my workflow or changing my hours even, or anything like that? It's probably actually you're less inclined to do so. I'm probably gonna sell the practice soon. The practice has been doing really well. I mean, the business has kind of done so well because of all the tailwinds around consumer willingness to spend on veterinary care and just overall consumer behaviors and psychographics. Like, it has led the veterinary practice to be okay without really needing to do much. Even though we all talk about, people are going to the vet less, like the business has done really well. That's why it's attracted so much capital. The last number I heard last week was now there's 55 private equity firms buying practices. Now, I don't make it sound like that's all bad. There's a lot of benefits. It's actually, I think, setting the stage for a lot of positive things to happen, because you're no longer then having to go sell the individual practice owner on a new piece of software or how to change, a workflow or some back-end process or integrating telemedicine or whatever it is. You can now talk to a group that owns 50 practices. Now, there's also the flip side of some of them have consolidated so much and so fast that they're not able to move as nimbly. So we'll see. Like, there's some positive to it. I think there's some negative, but that's my perspective, is that it has somewhat stunted growth from an innovation perspective because kind of haven't had to innovate. Whereas in human healthcare, it's just such a more complicated situation. You've got government regulation that has actually pushed innovation. The Affordable Care Act, say we will about it, but it created the need for electronic health records, and that one pushed a lot of doctors out of business, created a lot of consolidation because they couldn't afford to do all of those things that are very easy to criticize and they're burdensome and it's government mandated. But the positive is a lot more in the payer system. Similarly, like, only negative things to say probably about that. But one positive is it created consistent diagnosis codes, created everybody being digitized, and that's made it a lot easier for telemedicine companies to come in and easily integrate into a model that has a payer who's willing to subsidize the cost of telemedicine and a consumer who isn't having to really pay anything, and it's integrated into the medical records more easily, and so all of a sudden the whole thing kind of works better. So a lot of it's kind of been pushed by just one much bigger industry, government, and you have this interesting other component like the payer who is carrying a lot of the cost. Consumers are carrying the cost, but when it's an individual client, I think it manifests in either the form of like, I just won't do the thing that the doctor's telling me to do. I'll try to find it somewhere more cheaply. Whereas with human healthcare, we don't usually do that. Like if I don't want to go through with some surgery because I'm afraid of the surgery, I don't want to do it, I don't think it's worth it, I don't care enough about my health, that's one thing. But if your copay is $40 or $300 for some $30,000 procedure, it's a lot easier to say yes to that than something much less serious in veterinary care where you're paying maybe $1,500 and it's all out of pocket. So, interesting question. Curious if anyone else has different thoughts on why.
I guess my point or thought is kind of the parallel in product and tech development in the pet space and veterinary space then too, because I feel that a lot of that has been consolidated as well. We see a lot of new products and a lot of new softwares that are then purchased by a consolidator. And that then doesn't lend itself to further innovation of those products then. So they stall, they disappear. Whereas like tech and software is supposed to continuously iterate, and then it just stops. So I don't know if you have any other things to say about that.
I mean, that's a big trend we've all seen, and it's it's been a tough one to watch because a lot of times when those companies get bought and then innovation slows, sometimes it's a defensive acquisition where the companies are buying them to shut them down. Sometimes they genuinely want to roll it out, but then they run into the same issues that maybe that company was facing as an independent company, and they're less capable of doing it, selling in and innovating, and so then they give up. We've seen that a few times. So I think that's a challenge with it is a smaller market. It's a let's say $25 billion market, but you think about, okay, well, how much are people actually willing to spend on software? Well, going back to my point about IDEXX buying software and really underpricing it relative to, it's much more important to sell diagnostics, or Henry Schein doing the same thing. That creates a tough environment for a startup who's just selling software, if that's all they're going to do, right? Like they have to either price higher and just be that much better of a product and then convince people, which I think, again, going back to like what's happening with consolidation, I think it's easier for a larger consolidator to say, yes, it's gonna be more expensive. However, we actually know how to make use of not necessarily the data, but we actually know how to make use of a more efficient system. Whereas an individual practice, it's really hard to sell a small business owner on an ROI on some software. If it's really easy to use and it makes everything faster, like Toast is this incredible growth story in restaurants. And back when I was an investor before starting Whistle, I spent a lot of time looking at restaurant software, and none of these companies were doing well. And then as soon as I left, Toast popped up, and over the last 5 years has turned into a massive business. And the only reason is because it's created such a seamless experience, and the technology gotten so much easier, and so many more orders are coming through online. People are ordering delivery and takeout and all these things. So it's, again, the rails in the industry have changed things, but also like the software got that much better. But that's where it got so obvious that a restaurant owner could see the ROI. Like, I'm overwhelmed with orders, and I can see, and it's painless to switch. So either it hasn't become painless to switch, so these companies aren't growing fast enough, or they're not able to charge enough, or it's still coming, and there's enough of these consolidators who will be willing to support this ecosystem of new software. But I think it's partially a problem of a smaller market, I think. I think it's, if you're a venture capital firm and you're going to fund a software company not making money for a long time, you have to see a massive opportunity, and that's a little harder. Like Chewy, you could say, we're going to take over 25% of all e-commerce, and that's X billion dollars. It's a little bit harder. Like, how much spend is there really on veterinary software? There should be a lot more. But without veterinarians, I think, understanding the ROI, or not having had enough time of really good software being out in the market, I think it's harder to make that decision as a practice owner, I think.
So my name is Yale. I'm a first-time attendee of any veterinarian conference. A refugee from the healthcare industry.
Tell us all the answers.
First of all, so I represent Mela. We're one of the startups in the corner. Come check it out later. But so when you're talking about friction, one of the things that was really bothering me personally, and the reason we founded the company was, why are dogs still getting their temperatures measured by a thermometer up the butt? Okay, yes, that's, I know. Aaron, I want to apologize. I know you didn't ask me to pitch tomorrow, so that's why I'm doing it now. But we make a thermometer that you just put under the foreleg, and it gives you an accurate temperature reading. Of course, it's got wireless charging, Bluetooth, and all that cool stuff, but and an app. But the thing is, it was so obvious to me, 2 years ago when we started developing it, that I'm like, no, veterinary medicine isn't 30 years behind. It's 50 years behind.
So what have you learned from customers then so far? And who is your customer? Is it the veterinarian or is it the pet owner?
Every veterinarian that we've spoken to has said that they wanted one. And I'm like, how come nobody else has done it before? And I'm like, and I don't know. And I don't know. And also consumers, no dog owner who's not a veterinarian really wants to do that either. They don't want to stick a thermometer up their dog's butt. But now they don't have to.
I was hoping you'd answer this one, Christy.
Thank you, Steve. How are you?
Hey, good.
As a veterinarian, I don't like taking dogs' temperatures up their butt either, but it is the most accurate, or it has been. And I think it's what Steve has been saying all night. It's like, yes, we would all have preferred a better solution for that, but it hasn't been available to us. So now that there is more innovation, technology has gotten way cheaper, those types of devices have gotten way cheaper. The veterinarian space has been ignored in general by a lot of companies who innovate in this space. So I think now we're probably seeing the ability for a company like yours to stand up and go, hey, we've got this great device. We can make it cheaply enough for veterinarians to afford to buy it, and it can be readily available, right? Yeah, well, absolutely. And I'm assuming it is. Do you have a dog for us to try it on?
Yeah, we need to A/B test it.
We're gonna need it. We're gonna need to A/B test this. Phenomenal.
Awesome.
So one of the things that we were talking about before, and we'll wrap things up in a few minutes here, but one of the things we were talking about before was the market trends that are happening, right? And so if you look at the investment that's coming in from private equity, there's a ton of it right now. And the vet space and pet space more broadly is looking really attractive to people. There's a lot of talk at the same time that there is going to be a recession coming. Right? And so how do we think through that? Because right now, it's a great time to be in the pet space. It's an amazing time. And I don't know if people really realize how amazing it is, because we tend to talk a lot about the kind of downfalls that are happening, which are very real, and I don't want to discount those. But it is a really good time because of all that money that's coming in. So as we look forward into the future over the next couple of years, if we do hit that recession, which most people are saying we're going to hit something, how do we think through that? And how do we think about innovation at that point? Because it's easier to innovate when there are private equity companies calling all the time saying, do you know companies who need investment because we need to fill our portfolio slot of the pet space? And so they're looking at just throwing money at companies. And I know that sounds ridiculous. And for those of you who are raising, totally get that sounds insane, but there are lots of companies who are doing that, lots of firms who are doing that. So if there is a dip, if we do see a recession, how does the profession respond to that, and how do they think through that, given some of the things that we've talked about with innovation and success? Fix all our problems.
Yeah, that's a great question. And so I was at a conference called Little Fish last week with a bunch of the consolidators, and this was a big topic. And so no one has a crystal ball. Obviously, there was a banker, there was a panel with debt providers, and they all talked about it, and then a panel with consolidators, and they talked about it. Obviously, no one knows when it will happen, and I think the key thing is like what will happen. And I think we have data from like past recessions around how does consumer behavior change, and I don't see any reason why that would change. So let's assume like, yeah, people will probably be less willing to spend on certain types of care, but overall their pets are, one data point we had at Bain when I was at Bain was during the recession, people actually spent more on pet food than before the recession. And the reason was they were buying smaller packages of food that are higher priced. So it was really interesting to see that, and any like private equity investor that sees that data point is like, oh my God, this is the best market ever. And it's not completely recession proof, but it is fairly recession resistant. I think that what's going to happen though is you have all these private equity consolidators who have a lot of debt, which is how they've been buying a lot of practices. And that's when you start running into like tripping covenants with your lenders. And, you know, because of, I think the double-edged sword nature of the consolidation trend, they're going to have to become a lot more efficient. Whereas your sole practitioner could have survived fairly easily. Maybe they have to let someone go. Maybe they decrease their hours, whatever it is. Not that hard. I don't think we heard like a lot of stories of veterinary clinics going belly up during the recession. This time it might be a little different. But the benefit of it is I think there will be a very, very significant focus on efficiency. And there just isn't in this industry today. We've talked a little bit about practice management software and how that can help, but there's a lot of like even more basic stuff. It's not even technology. It's just like thinking about the design of your workflow in the veterinary practice and like what you can do differently to be more efficient. I think, is it Ken who's speaking on Sunday or about like kind of using technicians more effectively? Like that's one of my favorite topics hearing about in the industry, because it's like, it's not that hard. I don't say it's easy, as we're learning, but it's not that hard, like relative to some of the stuff we're talking about, like building full-fledged platforms and selling customers. And this is like, take your own practice, just like really look at it hard, at what you can do differently to be a little bit more efficient, save a little bit more time, spend a little bit less money, and not necessarily compromise delivery or care or anything like that. So I think there will be a massive focus on that, I think, if we hit a recession and some really big recession. And I think it will have to be the consolidators driving, like, we need to take a closer look at these businesses and how efficient they are in the bottom line ultimately.
That's great. So any final thoughts before final thoughts from Stephanie.
I don't want to be final thoughts. So historically, we know that animal health investments are fairly recession-proof because as our animals take more of a personal perspective in our life, then people are willing to sacrifice what they have to do in order to provide for their pets. I think what we have to make sure to do, and what we as an industry can do, is to recognize there is a difference between pet innovation and vet innovation. And there is more money that goes into pet innovation because that's a consumer-facing investment. But veterinary medicine is very different from human medicine, just purely from the economics. There are fewer patients getting care, and they don't have insurance to back them up. And therefore, in order for veterinary medicine to not be negatively impacted and veterinarians to be negatively impacted during recession times, we have to look to the pet innovators to bring veterinarians into that conversation to bulletproof the whole industry. That would be my 2 cents.
Thank you. It's a great point.
So I know that there's been another group of people who have been putting up their hands. That's when I love to stop, because it means the conversation is still going and we still have another day and a half to keep things going. So I'm going to let Steve offer any final thoughts that he wants to say, and then we'll wrap up, and we'll keep the bar open for a little bit to keep that conversation going.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I think first off, just a huge thank you to Aaron for bringing this event here, and Dean Setter for hosting it here, for everyone for joining and for being open to a very different format. I'm really encouraged by the participation. That was awesome. Usually it's like crickets and you have to pull teeth. So thank you guys. One, I would encourage anyone to really talk to anyone about this type of thing. Like rather than just hearing someone's pitch and just like applauding them, ask hard questions. If you're the one pitching, like ask yourself those hard questions. Find people around you to ask you those hard questions. It's not about just feeling good about ourselves or trying to justify our existence, right? Like try to have customers justify your experience. And I think the last point Stephanie made was a really good one around, we need to think about our veterinarians as customers. Think about the point about Chewy. Like if we focus on that about our clients, like you'll do the right thing for clients. It's not that hard. The really hard part is innovating within this industry, within the complex workflows, within treating patients, hiring staff, managing that, bringing in other ways to have access to clients. That's the hard part. I don't think it's rocket science, luckily, but it is going to take a lot of work. And I hope that the next 10 years we will see, maybe the recession will be a good thing, ultimately in driving some of this. But hopefully that's not what it takes. Hopefully it just takes some more critical thinking to get to the right answers. But if you ever want to talk to me, I love the shit. So my email is steven@modernanimal.com. Feel free to take up as much of my time, and my team will be very happy about that, I'm sure. Thank you, Aaron. Thanks, everybody.
All right. Thanks for experimenting with us. So for those people who don't have a program, we are starting off with our breakfast at 6:30 to 7:30, and the program itself begins at 7:30. We let you sleep in one day.